Okay, so you know how sometimes you just really want to like have a better conversation in English, like make it smoother, more enjoyable?
Mm-hmm.
Well, today we are going to deep dive into exactly that.
Awesome.
I asked you to find us some cool resources about this, and you really delivered.
Well, I try.
So we've got this transcript from a YouTube channel called Speak English with Class.
Okay.
And they have this podcast, English League Podcast. And this particular episode that we're going to look at is called How to Talk to Anyone, which is like such a big promise.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
But I think they actually have some really good stuff in here.
Yeah, and I think what's really cool is that it's not just about, the technicalities of English, but really about how to connect with people, which is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And, our listeners are always looking for things they can apply right away. And there's a lot of like actionable advice in here.
Definitely. Very practical.
Okay, so the podcast starts off talking about this feeling that I think a lot of people have of being intimidated or nervous when they're talking to people they perceive as like more successful or confident, particularly in English.
Right.
And they bring up this idea of like dropping that whole who's better mindset.
Right.
What did you think about that part?
Well, I think it's so important because, so much of the anxiety that we feel in conversations comes from this like comparison game that we play in our heads.
Yeah.
And so when they say, no one's above me and I'm not above anyone else, we're all just people, it just like completely reframes the whole interaction.
Hmm.
So instead of it being this like judgment or performance, it just becomes about two humans connecting,
Yeah.
which I think is really powerful.
Yeah. And I love that they talk about it in terms of like, native speakers aren't somehow like, on a higher level just because they're native speakers,
Right.
It's about connecting with someone, not like taking an English test,
Exactly.
And I think it's also good to remember that everyone makes mistakes in conversation.
Totally.
Even, even if English is your first language, we all say the wrong thing sometimes, or we stumble over our words,
Sure.
So then they get into this, I don't know if you've experienced this, but like that moment when somebody says, "How was your week?"
Yeah.
And your mind goes totally blank.
Oh, yeah. All the
Yeah,
time.
I'm like, I don't know. I don't remember. And they had this great idea of like, before you go out, just take a minute and think about like, what were a couple highlights of your week or something new you learned or an interesting experience you had, just so it's kind of fresh in your mind.
Yeah, I love that. It's like priming the pump a little bit,
Yeah.
so you're not like, going in totally unprepared.
Yeah.
You have something to draw on.
Yeah.
And I thought it was also a cool tip that they said to maybe keep a journal of, everyday events. So that way you can kind of remember those little details.
That's a good idea, yeah, to have that to refer to. And especially for, our listeners who are learning English, they specifically said it's helpful to practice talking about shows you've watched or activities you've done in English, just so that you kind of have that in your back pocket when nobody asks.
Yeah. And I think that's such a key point because it's one thing to study English grammar and vocabulary. But then when you're in an actual conversation, it's like, oh, wait, I have to actually use this stuff.
Right.
So the more you can kind of practice talking about your day-to-day life in English, the better prepared you'll be for those moments.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, nobody likes to feel caught off guard.
No, totally.
So, yeah, that's a great tip.
One thing that I thought was really interesting that they talked about was this idea of the power of observation as a way to start conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So just, noticing something in your surroundings, maybe there's a really long line at the coffee shop.
Right.
And just, saying something about that.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that as an icebreaker?
I think it's great because it immediately creates this shared experience, like you're both in this situation together.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be, anything profound. It can just be like, oh, this line is so long, or have you been here before? And it just, it kicks off the conversation in a really natural way.
Yeah. And they had some good examples like, have you been here before? Or I love your jacket. Where did you get it?
Yeah.
Really simple stuff. It's not about being witty or clever.
Yeah, I know.
It's just about making that little connection.
Exactly.
So I really like that. Then they talked about the idea of, viewing conversation as a skill, like something that you can get better at with practice, just like working out.
Right.
And they encouraged people to, start with small steps, like just saying hello or, ordering food in English.
Right.
What do you think about that kind of approach?
Well, I think it's so important because it kind of takes the pressure off, right? Like, you don't have to, be this amazing conversationalist right away.
Yeah.
You can just start small, and gradually build up your confidence.
Yeah.
And it's like, you wouldn't expect to run a marathon if you never went for a jog.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same with conversation, the more you do it, the better you'll get.
Yeah, totally. And they really emphasize that, it's okay to make mistakes. That's part of the process.
Yeah, for sure.
That's how we learn.
Exactly.
So then they shifted gears a little bit and talked about the importance of listening.
Oh, yes.
They said that, listening with curiosity actually encourages the other person to open up.
Right. Yeah.
Which then makes the whole conversation feel more natural and relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think being a good listener contributes to a better conversation?
I think it's huge because when you're really listening to someone, when you're genuinely interested in what they have to say, they feel heard and valued. Yeah.
And that just makes them want to open up more and share more.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes the pressure off of you, too, because you don't have to be constantly thinking about what you're going to say next.
Right. You're not. Yeah.
You can just be present and really listen.
Yeah.
And they even gave this great tip of repeating a little bit of what someone said. Like, oh, so you went hiking last weekend,
Mm-hmm.
just to show that you're engaged and to keep the conversation flowing.
Yeah, that's a good one. And they also said, just simple things like, that's cool, or really, tell me more, just to kind of stay involved.
Exactly. It's those little acknowledgments that make a big difference.
Yeah, and it reinforces this idea that, people really just want to feel heard.
Mm.
More than they want to be impressed by your vocabulary or your perfect grammar.
Exactly.
Okay, so then the podcast talked about navigating different types of conversations.
Right.
So talking to strangers versus talking to acquaintances versus talking to close friends.
What were some of the differences they highlighted there?
Well, they talked about how talking to a stranger is kind of like a fresh start, There's no pressure to remember anything or know anything about them.
Right, right.
And with acquaintances, they said it's good to kind of treat it like a clean slate, too.
Mm-hmm.
Just start with some simple questions like, hey, how's that project going? Or how was your trip?
Yeah.
Just to kind of reconnect.
Right, yeah.
And then with friends, obviously, there's that, shared history and comfort level.
Yeah, totally.
So the conversations tend to flow more naturally.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was a really interesting distinction.
Yeah, and I like how they, they recommended for English learners to kind of adjust their confidence level based on who you're talking to.
Right.
Like using conversations with strangers as good practice,
Mm-hmm.
seeing conversations with acquaintances as a chance to reconnect,
Yeah.
and then just being themselves with friends.
Exactly.
They had this great analogy about a snowball to explain how we build and maintain connections with people.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that one.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So they said, every time you have a conversation with someone, it's like you're adding a little bit of snow to this snowball.
Mm-hmm.
So with acquaintances, maybe you're just adding a little bit of snow at a time, with small talk and brief interactions.
Yeah.
But with friends, you're having more frequent conversations and sharing more, so the snowball grows faster.
Mm-hmm.
But the key is to keep adding snow, right?
Right.
Because if you neglect those connections, the snowball can start to melt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's important to, stay in touch and keep nurturing those relationships.
Yeah, and I think, for our listeners who are learning English, it's really that message of every conversation counts, even if it's short.
Exactly. Don't wait until you feel like your English is perfect to start building those relationships.
Right.
Just get out there and start talking. Totally. The more you practice, the better you'll get.
So then they talked about, sometimes conversations naturally come to an end.
Right.
And they talked about the importance of a graceful exit.
Mm-hmm.
And even gave some examples of polite phrases we can use.
Yeah.
Why is it so important to know how to end a conversation well?
I think it's just good social etiquette, It shows that you respect the other person's time,
Mm-hmm.
and it prevents those awkward moments of silence or, abrupt departures.
Right, yeah.
So they had some good examples like, I'm going to grab a drink, but it's been lovely chatting, or I need to step away for a bit. Great talking with you.
Yeah, those are good ones.
Just something simple and polite
Mm-hmm.
to let the other person know that you're ready to wrap things up.
Right. Yeah, and then before they got into the end of the podcast, they had a section called Pro Conversation Tips, which I thought was really useful.
Yeah, what were some of the takeaways from that?
Well, they really emphasized being present, focusing on the person you're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
not, getting caught up in your head trying to think of the perfect reply.
Right, right.
Just really listening to what they're saying.
Yeah.
And then they talked about paraphrasing, repeating what you heard in your own words, just to kind of show that you're listening and keep the conversation going.
Right.
And they also said it's good to have a few, enjoyable topics that you can talk about with almost anyone,
Mm-hmm.
like food or music or travel.
Yeah, safe topics, right?
Yeah, just, things that are generally interesting.
Exactly.
And then they reminded us that, acquaintances are actually really valuable.
Mm-hmm.
They can help us expand our social circle and even lead to new opportunities.
Yeah, totally.
So it's good to, nurture those connections.
Yeah, I think it's easy to just kind of, focus on our close friends.
Right, right.
But, acquaintances can be really important too.
Sure. Okay, and then the last thing they did was they had a little vocabulary boost section where they highlighted some of the words and phrases they used throughout the podcast.
Oh, yeah, that's always helpful.
Yeah, so they talked about words like, intimidated, engage, caught off guard, kicked off, curiosity, acquaintances, second guessing, paraphrase, icebreaker, and step away.
Right. Good vocabulary words.
Yeah, and I think, for our listeners who are learning English, it's good to specifically focus on those kinds of intermediate level words and phrases.
Totally, because it helps you to express yourself more clearly and accurately.
Yeah, and it just makes your English sound more natural and more confident.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so I think we covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Yeah, we
We
did.
talked about the importance of having a positive mindset and, preparing some topics to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about using observation to start conversations and viewing conversation as a skill that you can get better at with practice.
Right.
And then, of course, the importance of active listening
Mm-hmm.
and how to adjust your approach based on who you're talking to.
Exactly.
We talked about building and maintaining those connections over time and making graceful exits when it's time to end a conversation.
Yeah, and I think the main takeaway for me is that, improving your English conversation skills is really about connecting with other people and,
Right.
taking small, consistent steps.
Yeah.
It's not about being perfect.
Yeah, totally. It's about, being present and being engaged.
Exactly.
So I want you to think about this. What's one small thing you can do today to try out one of the strategies we talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay.
And, how much just focusing on being present and really listening instead of worrying about saying the perfect thing, change the experience of your next conversation in English.
Yeah, that's something to think about.
That's something to think about. All right, thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone.
Thanks for having me.